Welcome, and thank you for joining LPG Talks Live. My name is André Pimentel, and I'm with ANOVA, the remote monitoring partner and industry council member of the World LPG Association. It is an honor to host the fourth edition of the LPG Talks Live series. Today, we will be discussing LPG for power generation, global opportunities. We had a huge interest in this session. We got 343 registrations, which is a record high for the LPG Talks Live attendance. Thank you all for your interest, for signing up and tuning in. We hope you will find the discussion today helpful and actionable. First, I am pleased to welcome James Rocco, CEO and Managing Director of the World LPG Association. Welcome, James, and thank you so much for joining us today and for kicking off this fourth edition of the LPG Talks Live.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you, Andre, for the for the introduction. And also thank you to ANOVA for hosting this series of LPG Talks Live, which today, as Andre said, is a record number of participants. We're going to talk about the opportunity for LPG in power generation. I'd like to start by saying that this is a WLPGA meeting, and any discussion of company-specific commercial information, pricing, market shares, etc., will be absolutely prohibited. And moving on from that, you've seen, I'm sure in the news, that our world is becoming increasingly electrified and increasingly low carbon. And I believe that these trends provide great opportunity for the growth of LPG fuel power systems. As we look to the future, I really believe that LPG should be the fuel of choice for power generation in lots of situations around the world. And why do I say that? Well, LPG firstly is unique. It's exceptional. It's transported and stored as a liquid, but it's used as a gas, and it can deliver cleaner power, lower emissions power than pretty much every alternative out there. With renewable LPG, carbon emissions can be dropped another 80%, ensuring that the infrastructure that we put in place now is essentially future-proof. It's the ideal fuel for small-scale distributed generation, serving all those areas of the world that currently don't have access to electricity or grids, importantly, but it's also a great backup to renewables, providing guaranteed low emissions availability when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind doesn't blow. Our industry across the world is working towards society's common goals of low carbon emissions and clean energy. And LPG as a fuel for power generation is clearly part of the solution to the world's future energy challenges. And as we reflect on future energy challenges, I'd also like to bring your attention to this year's LPG Week, which we're going to be holding in December, hosted by Enoch, under the theme Energizing Tomorrow. We will reconvene face-to-face, so we'll be traveling all, hopefully, to Dubai from December the 5th. And if you're interested, I'd like you to take a look at a short video that we've got before we start the webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Great teaser on LPG Week. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing all of you face-to-face in Dubai in December. Moving to the next item on the agenda, we have a panel discussion on LPG for power generation, global opportunities. Michael Kelly is the Chief Advocacy Officer and Deputy Managing Director of the World LPG Association, and will be moderating our panel today. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Andre, and hello to all of you out there watching this LPG Talks. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are discussing LPG for power generation, which has been an area that the World LPG Association has been focusing on with some significance starting around 2016. It's the first time that we as an association noticed that there was this significant amount of interest and significant amount of opportunity in this market. In 2017, we structured the working group for LPG for power generation. And it's using that working group that we've really started to push this issue. We think we're starting to get a lot of traction. I think the number of people that have registered for this event today reflects that. And we'll be discussing with our panelists today the different opportunities that exist around the world and where they see further opportunities in the future and what the challenges are. What we're trying to do is raise awareness about the potential for LPG for power and grow that segment of our industry. Now, as we go along, we're going to hear from three different panelists: Christoph Reimnitz, who is the current chairman of the working group for LPG for power, Jim Cruz from Capstone Green Energy, and Michael Welsh from Siemens. But as we go through this, I encourage you to ask questions. We want to keep this interactive. We want to hear from you. You have three different ways or two different ways you can ask questions. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please use the Q&A box and not necessarily the chat. The Q&A box allows us to better monitor your questions. Otherwise, you can raise your hand. And there's a tool for you at the bottom of your screen also to raise your hand, and we will see it and we will call on you. We do pledge that even if we don't get to your questions here today, we will answer them in the future. So let me introduce our first panelist, who's going to give a scene-setting presentation to kick us off, and that is Christoph Reimnitz, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the current chairman and actually the founding chairman of the working group for LPG for power with the WLPGA. Most recently, he was the vice president of strategic development for APR Energy, but he spent the bulk of his career with General Electric, and he ended his career there as the head of global structuring for GE's gas to power team. And that's how he came to get involved with this. So Christoph, please walk us through your presentation.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are out there. And Michael, thank you very much for that introduction. We started, as James and Michael were alluding, the initiative LPG for Power in the World LPG Association roughly 5 years ago. And since then, we've seen a considerable uptake and interest in LPG to power generation. But what we've also seen is different uses. And what I would like to do today is take you through a few examples where LPG to power is being applied. So I'm giving you a few case studies, as it were. But at the same time, we also are seeing clearly a profile emerging. And that is part of the interest that we've been able to condense for you, hopefully, in a meaningful way today. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I think one of the first things I'd like to point out and make clear is that LPG is gas. And the reason why that is important is because gas to power has been used a lot over the last decade. And it is often natural gas, not LPG, that is associated with gas to power. But LPG is just as much gas as natural gas is. It consists of carbon and hydrogen molecules. So I think that is important. And often when we have conversations with those who are considering new power installations, it's a point that's overlooked and not fully understood. But let me first also catch up on one of the points that James Rocco made in his introductory remarks, which is decarbonization. We hear it constantly, and it is in the press everywhere. And the climate change that is associated and that is driving the decarbonization is going to vary depending on where you are in the world. And if I look at a place like Africa, decarbonization plays a role, but it plays a different role because there are still 800 million people without access to electricity. So gas, as recognized by the International Energy Agency in its very recently published Net Zero by 2050 report, said that gas is going to play a role as a bridging fuel. And that is the hook why I think you out there, as you're thinking about feedstock and power generation and uninterrupted dispatchable power generation, should be considering LPG. And here's why. We have more than 100 countries worldwide today that have LPG import infrastructure, way more than LNG, which is liquefied natural gas and is the liquefied form of natural gas, has, which is today about 44 countries. So there is infrastructure out there available that can be used, that should be leveraged as you're considering power generation. With that comes very often the regulatory acceptance. And we have that because LPG is mostly used as a cooking fuel and is being handled in a domestic environment. So it needs to be handled properly without having accidents or mishaps. And that is why regulations are in place in most countries, which is very helpful. As I'm going to be showing is LPG is suitable for hybrid renewable solutions, particularly, and it should be displacing liquid fuels like diesel, HFO. The reason for that being is that HFO and diesel, if they're using as the dispatchable element of power, they're canceling out these fuels, the benefits of renewables, the environmental benefits, that is. And then a more scientific point, it's the high calorific value of LPG that makes handling so interesting, because you get quite a significant amount of power out of it, or energy out of LPG. And that's why it is an attractive fuel for power generations. So we're not going to make any advertisement here for any of the original equipment manufacturers, but all of them, I can tell you, have solutions available, whether it's gas turbines or engines that are capable of running on LPG today, which is a great development and progress that has happened over the last decade. If I could have the next slide, please. I'd like to give you three very brief examples just to help you understand where LPG has been used more recently and where it's been a big success. You see here a picture of a hospital in Puerto Rico. In 2017, as you may recall, Hurricane Maria struck the island, killing more than 2,970 people across the island and bringing down the power grid. So people were left without electricity. Now, interestingly enough, this hospital had decided 6 months earlier to install an LPG to power generation facility. So they put in 2 engines. At the time, Jenbacher was the manufacturer of those engines with LPG supply. And this enabled them to operate throughout the hurricane. And as a hospital, you can imagine how important that is, with people being brought in with injuries. So without any interruption, this hospital had uninterrupted power supply throughout the hurricane and afterwards, whereas the rest of the island was suffering power outages. So I think it's a very powerful example, and as a result, we've seen on the island of Puerto Rico quite a number of installations that today are running on LPG. What should also be highlighted was that the sales pitch, obviously nobody knew in February when the power generation was installed that the hurricane was going to strike 6 months later. It was competitive in terms of pricing. 27% in the original pitches less than diesel that was being contemplated as an alternative fuel. So if I could have the next slide, please. Another example, and this fits in with energy transition, is in Chile. In Chile, the country has seen a fourfold uptake in electricity utilization over the last 35 years. Now, a country like Chile was originally very much dependent on its hydropower, and that share has gone down as a result of climate change, but also because so much more power is needed today. So just to give you some magnitude, there was about, in 1990, about 100 terawatt hours of electricity used throughout the country. Today, we're at more than 400 terawatt hours, around 430. So as new electricity is being needed, consumed in the country, the shift has been towards renewables. The challenge with renewables is whether you're using solar power, you will only get electricity when the sun is shining, or if you're using wind power, then when the wind is blowing. So it is fossil fuels that usually provide the gap filler, the dispatchable element, and provide the electricity when neither wind or sun are doing what they're supposed to be doing for power generation purposes. And what the LPG member Inersa has done is they've built a power plant that is running on LPG as feedstock, and that is jumping in to provide electricity through these electricity gaps. It's been operating more than the 10% that were anticipated in year one, and so far, according to Gasco, which is the LPG member, it's been quite a success. And I think this is an example of where LPG can play a role to bridge that intermittency that we're seeing from renewables. Particularly here in Chile, another few points. The logistics were compelling. You had several sources of LPG in proximity to the power plant. So Gasco could switch very cleverly between different storage stations if there were any mishaps in or unavailabilities in LPG. So the continuous supply of LPG was secured. And if I could have my next slide, please. Now, LPG is also used in large-scale power plants, and we kicked off the LPG to Power Working Group in 2016 with a presentation on what was called Ghana Bridge. In Ghana, at the time, there was a significant need for power, and the then chairman of and CEO of GE promised the president of Ghana and said, we can bring LPG to power or power to your country in a very short period of time. Now, we're here almost 5 years later, and as we speak, this power plant, large in scale, 200 megawatts or 202 to be precise, is being commissioned with LPG. This is certainly at the larger end of the spectrum, but it shows that in a large scale environment, LPG can equally be used for power generation purposes. And the idea in Ghana was to use the LPG because there is indigenous gas onshore and offshore in Ghana, but it takes time to lift, capital expenditure is required. And prior to that lifting of the power, it was required to find an interim solution. And there were gas storage tanks already available, an old refinery, and that is how LPG to power came into play in Ghana. I've given you 3 quite different examples of the use of LPG to power. There are many more available. You will hear from our next panel speakers some of the uses that they see for LPG to power. And the WLPGA website has a number of case studies that we've published there that you may want to go to if you like to learn more about LPG for power generation. So thank you very much for your attention. Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. And I'm happy to say we're already starting to get questions that we're not going to get to right now, but we will get to them later from Bartholomew, Bartholow, Aston, and Charlie. It's encouraging to see that the questions are already come in. Christoph gave us case studies from Puerto Rico, from Chile, and from Ghana, and this leads into the poll question that we're going to put up for you now. And you should see it in front of you. And the question is, what region of the world do you think has the most opportunity for LPG for power generation? And I can see we're at about 20% voted. It's interesting to see which continent seems to be leading. I don't want to give away anything, but if you please get your vote in, we should have it in the next 20 seconds or so. We will finalize this poll. And I think it give us a good indication of where those on the call see the opportunity for growth in this market, and then maybe that can feed into the questions that we asked the panelists later. We're at 75%, so if you haven't voted, please do. And we'll let this go for a few more seconds before we decide to call an end to the poll. We're stuck at 77%. Okay, Bridget, if I could ask you to end the polling there. And as you can see, 48% of you think that Africa is the continent or the region that has the most opportunity for LPG for power generation, followed by Asia, and then Latin America in the Caribbean. Interesting that Europe and North America score relatively low, and Oceania as well. So something to think about and something to consider as we move forward in this discussion. Our next speaker is Mr. Michael Welsh. If we could take the poll away, please, Bridget. Mr. Michael Welsh, who is the industry marketing manager for Siemens Energy Industrial Gas Turbines. He is based in the United Kingdom, and he's part of the emerging technologies team. So with a responsibility looking at new opportunities for the complete range of Siemens Energy's industrial and aeroderivative gas turbines, with a specific focus on energy efficiency, decarbonization, and alternative fuels. I have to say, Michael has been very active in the working group since it was formed. We're happy to have him here today. Michael, please, your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Michael. Welcome, everybody. Thank you to the WLPGA for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Siemens Energy has a range of gas engines and gas turbines which are able to operate on LPG, from a few hundred kilowatts up to 60 megawatts plus. And LPG really is perhaps an overlooked fuel. The focus tends to be on natural gas and pipelines and LNG, but there's considerable potential for microgrids and off-grid generation. And that's where LPG has a major role to play. In fact, if you go back about 30 years, I recall before gas grids were built in some countries like Japan and Turkey, LPG was the bridging fuel from coal and heavy fuel oil to natural gas. And now we're seeing LPG as the bridging fuel from fossil fuels to a renewable future. And looking at the poll, I agree totally that Africa is one of the regions that is most interesting for LPG, because when you consider the energy transition, one of the things most people forget is that to build your solar panels and your wind turbines, you need minerals. And a lot of these minerals are going to come from off-grid locations in Central Asia, China, and particularly in Africa. And if the mining industry is going to reduce its carbon footprint, it's got to use a low carbon fuel. And so if we can switch the mining industry from heavy fuel oil and diesel to LPG, for example, then we're instantly showing a 15 to 20% reduction in their CO2 footprint. As you move on, you start building up the grid system, you start adding renewables, and your baseload LPG power plant nicely transitions into a backup plant or a peaking plant. So it's supporting the grid with the variability of these renewable systems. And ultimately, it becomes the peaking plant to react as just an emergency system. And we're starting to see these types of projects already. The last order we got was for a 50 megawatt gas turbine in South America, which is basically an emergency plant. This is going to back up the grid in case of El Nino events when there's not enough water to run the hydro plants. And so that's at the one end of the scale. At the other end of the scale, we're seeing LPG into microgrids with solar and wind turbines, and creating whole hybrid systems for small industrial plants, such as small refineries and breweries, even all the way up to cement plants and mines with multi-megawatt opportunities. So LPG really is a really versatile fuel. And it's great for it as a backup fuel because it doesn't expire. Its life is years. It doesn't boil off like LNG, and it's much more easy to transport and economically viable at a small scale than an LNG system. Back to you, Michael.
Thank you. And actually, you know, we just lost Jim Krause from Capstone. So I want to move into questions, and I want to build on something that you said, because it was referenced by Christoph as well. So maybe this is for both of you before we get to these questions from the audience, and before Jim comes back. But you both mentioned the competition between LNG and LPG, and why is LPG better than LNG under certain circumstances? What would you say? And we'll start with you, Michael, and then maybe you, Christoph.
If you have an existing gas grid, because you had a natural gas infrastructure and now you're just supplementing what gas you used to produce or import by pipeline with LNG, then LNG works great. If you don't have that natural gas network, which in many developing countries and remote regions of some of the developed countries, you simply don't have, transportation of LNG is really quite difficult. And even when you're storing it, and that's an expensive business because you're storing it as a boiling cryogen at minus 160 degrees C, you're losing a fraction of your fuel every day. If you transport or store LNG in an ISO container, then it's roughly 1/4% every day just boils off. So you've got to handle it somehow. Now, if you're running your unit on LNG, you can feed it into the fuel system with a few extra systems to make it suitable. If you're using your LNG as a backup fuel, now you've got to put in a reliquefaction circuit to feed it back. And so LPG, because you're storing it under slight pressure, it just sits there, doesn't degrade, doesn't boil off or anything. And when you look at the economics, and a number of the LPG suppliers have done similar calculations to us, if there is no supply infrastructure at all, and you're looking, do I go LNG or LPG, then the cost of the infrastructure build up for plants below 100, 150 megawatts is more economical to go down the LPG route than the LNG route. And if you're bringing it in by tanker, there are many more medium-sized LPG tankers that can supply those relatively small amounts of LPG, thousands of tons a month. But compared to LNG, it's a small amount than they are with the LNG tankers, which tend to be massive things carrying tens of thousands of tons.
Interesting. Christoph, can you add to that?
Yes, I think Michael hit it very well. It's a question of scale. And if we look at the applications in places like Latin America, the Caribbean, or Africa, it's not about large-scale centralized power plants. It's more about small-scale decentralized power or off-grid power, as Michael was saying. And I've been sitting here scanning some of the questions, and I'll just give two examples, and then I'll let you introduce Jim. A 1 megawatt turbine, gas engine, if you're using that on running that on base load 24 hours a day, you probably consume around 1.5 tons of LPG. Now, your typical cigar or your container, ISO container for LPG is 25 tons, gives you an example how long that lasts. And I've just scanned one of the other questions here, and I just want to take that as well on Ghana. Yes, the 770 tons per day is what we're looking at a 200 megawatt power plant if that's running on base load. So I hope I've been able to swish by and take two of the answers off the and give it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. We are getting a load of questions coming in. Keep them coming. And again, we promise that if we don't get to them specifically during this discussion, we will get to them later. But let me introduce now Jim Cruz, who is the Chief Revenue Officer for Capstone Green Energy. He was appointed as Chief Revenue Officer on December 1st, 2019, and he's providing strategic direction of overall business development with a focus on top line revenue growth. Something that's interesting about Jim is he's also served on special advisory boards and boards of directors, and he has testified to Congress on a number of renewable energy and energy efficiency issues on multiple occasions. That sounds like fun, Jim. Another thing to say is that Capstone is the newest member of the World LPG Association. They became a member just yesterday. And we have a case study that's released, that we're just releasing. It'll come up in the chat right now. You can see the link there of a system that they have in Margaritaville, which is in the Virgin Islands. And Jim, tell us about your microturbines.
Great, thanks, Michael. Happy to be a new member and looking forward to doing lots of good LPG projects around the world. So Capstone Green Energy is a new name for the company. We rebranded and changed the name on Earth Day this year. And our core business is still microturbines today. But as the world looks to decarbonize and to become greener, we look at also combining additional technologies to optimize the performance of any of the technologies we install. So whether it's battery storage and a microturbine or battery storage and a gas engine, the combination of technologies oftentimes provides additional value or benefit to a customer, especially in remote applications where operating the equipment at a consistent or higher percentage of rated load can provide efficiency gains that would not be seen if you weren't able to combine some of those technologies together. Our microturbines are a little bit unique. They run on air bearings, which is sort of a cornerstone of Capstone technology. So we don't use any lubricating oil or coolants. So they have very long service intervals, similar to what you would get with a large gas turbine, but only in a very small package. The output is inverter based, so they're very easy to connect together. And we start fairly small. So our smallest turbine today is 65 kilowatts, and then we go up from there. And we're able to do projects from that, 50 kilowatts up into the multi-megawatt range with the technology we have. LPG has always been an interesting fuel for us. We've done quite a few projects over the years around the world. And most of the time it's been remote power. And so remote power running on LPG, or in some cases even a propane butane mix, which is fairly common in certain parts of the world, is a attractive fuel for us, both from a technical perspective, the turbines run well on it, but also from a commercial perspective, oftentimes the fuel or energy savings combined with the financial savings doing fuel switching from diesel or another fuel that's more expensive can provide a lot of benefit to customers. And using a cleaner fuel gives you an opportunity to easily use some of the waste heat that you would normally not be able to capture and provide cogeneration or CHP to customers that traditionally are looking to satisfy a power only sort of configuration. So no, it's a great fuel. We've got projects in most of the places that were high on the list there. Africa, we've got projects, Caribbean, Latin America, Pacific Islands. We've actually done a few projects there that are interesting. And I think as the LPG industry continues to educate customers and improves the supply chain and educates the supply chain about the value and benefits of LPG as a power plant fuel, whether it's a small power plant like ours or a much larger power plant like Siemens or other large turbine manufacturers can provide, the value and the benefit is still there.
That's really interesting, and it leads into a question I want to ask for all three of the panelists: is what should we be doing as an industry to grow this segment? We did a study in 2018 where we analyzed the market opportunity for LPG in a number of different countries, and what came back was that the single biggest barrier to growing this segment among policymakers in particular was a simple lack of knowledge that LPG is even a solution. Many people don't know that it even exists as a possibility as a solution. So we'll start with you, Christoph. If you could tell the LPG industry the top three things it should do to grow this segment, what would they be?
So, Michael, I think you're absolutely right. It's all about advocacy, and I think it is scalability here of what you have in terms of infrastructure in your country. So, getting people comfortable with the fact that LPG is being used for cooking and is available, is being imported into almost every country, and that this is an easy add-on. It's a fantastic bridging fuel, as we pointed out, Michael pointed out as well earlier, Michael Welch, that is, as we're looking to transition into a cleaner, less carbon intense environment, I think LPG can play that role because of that duality of use of LPG. I think the last thing is the importance of demonstrating the track record that LPG has had as a safe fuel.
Okay, excellent, interesting. Michael, top three things you tell the industry to do to grow this segment.
First thing is raise the awareness that LPG is a great fuel, no matter whether you're a few kilowatts up to hundreds of megawatts. It's a great clean fuel to use. And then it's not just about the CO2 savings, but it's also about the other environmental pollution you get. When people default to diesel and particularly heavy fuel oil in developing nations, you're also polluting the environment with sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, unburnt hydrocarbons, all of which are hazardous to the environment and human health. With LPG, you eliminate almost 90% of those emissions. Some it's about 100% in the case of sulfur oxides. So there's huge local benefits as well as the global benefit. The final thing I would say is to the LPG industry itself is to, and I saw this actually in one of the questions, work out a way of getting better visibility of long-term pricing contracts, rather like the LNG industry does, where it's you've 10-year, 15-year offtake agreements from an LNG plant. So although there is some variability in the pricing based on oil prices and there's index pricing, you don't get the same amount of variability in the pricing that you do with LPG, where it's very much seasonal as well as oil price related.
Yeah, that's a perennial problem in our industry completely when we're talking about competition with the natural gas industry or with LNG. Jim, top three things you'd say to the LPG industry that we should be doing to grow this segment.
I think I'll mirror the other answers here. Education, can't say enough about how important it is to educate and advocate for the industry. And then I would say pricing and pricing transparency is very important. And then for me, the sort of the third element of it is sort of the last mile or the local piece, right? That a lot of the perception is around LPG being a bottle gas fuel or for cooking, which ties back into the education, but it's also some of the local partners that our fuel suppliers don't have the power plant fuel supplier mentality just yet. So to the extent the industry can work with the local distributors and suppliers in many of these places to help them understand the value for their businesses of getting higher volumes and what it can mean for the rest of the business would be on my list as well.
Yep, yep, very interesting, very interesting. Christoph, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. There's one point we got to make, and it's coming through in some of the questions that I've just scanned, is the pricing point. And Jim, you just...
Oh, you just muted yourself, Christoph.
Thank you. It's one of the points that comes up, and in some of the questions, and Jim alluded to that, is the pricing. And
yeah.
I think people need to be careful. It's not a comparison LPG for LNG pricing. Every time you touch fuel, LPG or LNG, the price moves, but it moves much more dramatically when you move LNG because of the cryogenic nature of the fuel. So you need to keep it refrigerated, and the infrastructure many times is not in place. Whereas with LPG, it is in place. So I think the pricing aspect of LPG needs to be considered in the context of every specific project and needs to be calculated. That's the way things are. Yes, there is, as Michael Welch pointed out, volatility in LPG prices, and they get passed through. But I can assure the audience we've done an analysis, or I have done an analysis with one of my previous employers. We looked at South Africa in Saldanha Bay, which was one of the sites considered for power generation, and LPG was competing there against diesel and was more than 30% less expensive. So I think those are the kind of comparisons that need to be made on a case-by-case basis. And broadly speaking, particularly for the smaller off-grid applications, LPG is very competitive in pricing.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that full-throated endorsement, Christoph. I want to go to one of the questions that's come in. It's from Scott Vildovas. And Christoph, you alluded to this, I think, at the beginning in your opening statement. He said he's interested to hear about machine options to utilize mixed LPG, so a mix of butane and propane and other impurities. He talks ethane, heavies, and CO2. We keep getting told we can only burn propane. And I think this is what used to be. Michael, you're laughing over there. What are you laughing about?
It's one of these misconceptions. I think it depends on who you talk to. Certainly, our range of engines will run on propane butane blends up to 30 or 40% butane. And when you move to gas turbines, it changes again. It's very much model specific, but we're now looking at, we have engines that can burn 100% butane in dry low emissions combustion systems. So the range of fuels is there depending on the size of the equipment you want and the application you're trying to put it into.
Okay.
Yep. And I'll mirror that. So we have products that will run on HD5 or propane, and all the way in any blend all the way up to 100% butane. So the technology is there. I think that the misperception, and me being the turbine guy, I'll give engines a plug here. The advancement in detonation sensing and engine controls, ignition, and air fuel ratio has allowed gas engines to operate much more reliably and consistently on different blends of propane butane mix than they would even just 10, 15 years ago.
Christoph, would you like to add?
Yes, couldn't agree more. Thank you.
Okay, short and sweet. All right, let's go to another question. And again, a general kind of question. Why hasn't LPG been more broadly used for power generation? I mean, we've touched on this issue of lack of awareness. Is there anything else that is contributing to the fact that there hasn't been as much uptake of this segment as the industry certainly hopes, or as we had expected in the past? Again, Michael, the vigorous nodding of the head. I'm gonna pass over to you to kick this off.
I think it's almost a case of continuing to do what's always been done because it's more convenient. If you look in many countries, it's much easier just to expand your existing power generation facilities and do the same as you've done before, and expand your power plant by adding another 3 or 4 heavy fuel oil engines. And in industry, you're used to having diesel generator sets. Let's just put another one in. It's quick, simple. I know it works. making a switch to something different, where you might have concerns about the fuel supply infrastructure, for instance, is a big challenge for a big mental challenge for a lot of companies to take.
Interesting. Jim, let's change order up. Your thoughts.
I agree that, you know, the people tend to do what they did last time is part of the challenge. I also say that in the places where, you know, there's a huge need and opportunity, diesel is the incumbent fuel, and the supply network and the infrastructure that's there is oftentimes far more developed and mature than it is for LPG as a power plant fuel, right? The bottle gas is there, but from a power plant fuel perspective, it's not always as readily available as is some of the other fuel alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah. Christoph?
Well, I think there's one other point. An important factor is the availability of LPG that's grown significantly. So the volume of LPG that's being produced, and most of that has come through shale gas in the United States, because LPG has been an associated gas or byproduct of the shale gas revolution. So the US has become a net exporter of LPG. And whereas historically, and Michael Welch was earlier referring to that, you know, in Japan, they were using LPG back in the last century, so in the 80s and 90s. But then LPG prices became prohibitively expensive because LPG was mostly a refined byproduct. With all the gas exploration that we're seeing today, we're seeing a lot more LPG becoming available. So the volume, the overall volume of the LPG market has grown significantly over the last decade. And I think that's been a factor as well.
Excellent point.
And it's okay, if it's okay, Mike, I'd just add that while my comment may have sounded a little, you know, more skeptical of LPG, I think that what we found is if you invest the time and do a little planning, LPG versus, say, diesel can be as reliable and or as available. You just have to look and make the plans and arrangements to get it there. And that's been our experience, is that there's plenty of supply, there's plenty of suppliers, and you just have to make the choice to switch to a cleaner, better fuel.
Yep. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Good points. We have a question, a hand raised by Tucker Perkins from the Propane Education and Research Council in the United States. Tucker's a good friend of the WLPGA. Tucker, I'll ask you to unmute yourself. If you want to turn on your camera, you're welcome to, and ask your question, please. Tucker? Okay, well, we've lost Tucker. Then let's switch gears and move into a question. And there's a question from Rebecca Ball that came in, and this is maybe going to be more for you, Jim, but she's asking about the opportunity to focus on small engines in power generation, noting that in developing countries, smaller engines make more sense because there's simply a lack of energy. She points out the South African example of the load shedding and the problems that Eskom is having at the moment. Do you think that there's significant opportunity for quite small gensets? Is that a bigger opportunity than, say, larger systems and plants?
You know, certainly there's a huge opportunity for smaller distributed type solutions. You know, engines and microturbines can provide anywhere from one building to a community, you know, telecom. There's a lot of different applications where it makes a lot of sense to look at a smaller technology that's used as sort of inside the fence, whether it's standalone or grid connected in some cases. But yes, absolutely, the technology is available, and it's cost effective and reliable all the way down into the, you know, few kilowatt range.
Michael and Christoph, can you contribute to that? Because Siemens doesn't play in this sandbox, does it? It's mostly larger systems, and I think GE's was the same. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, we do have a range of gas engines that go down to about 100 kilowatts. So we were at the top end, maybe. We're looking at village or town size or small hotel. But yeah, there is huge opportunities really in that size. It's application dependent. I mean, I think Jim's hospital example Christoph's hospital example that he puts up is an excellent opportunity for small microgrids, and we see them in similar size things in hotels and office blocks and small industries for off-grid power. And in most of the cases, the LPG power plants have displaced small diesels.
Yep.
I'd like to, Michael, sorry, I'd like to add another point, and I mentioned it on the slide of the hospital in Puerto Rico. It's combined heat and power that is actually very effective using engines that can run on LPG. What you get is you get much higher efficiency. So you can use the heat for steam purposes or for heating through a heat exchanger. You can also use it for cooling purposes. So you get a much higher efficiency. That won't be able with any liquid fuels such as diesel or HFO. So, I mean, that's a whole separate conversation. But when people kind of question and say, well, there is a loss of power on the equipment because if you're using LPG versus, natural gas, well, natural gas may actually not be available. So you have to benchmark it against diesel or HFO. And here, these are the clear benefits.
Yeah, okay, interesting. All right, Robert, someone's telling me there's a question at the bottom of the Q&A, but there's lots of questions. Look, I'm going to keep my eye on the time. We have one more question I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to ask you for final statements. And this question, Michael, maybe you should kick this off because it feeds into this discussion about decarbonization. At WPGA, we're preparing right now for the climate change COP26 negotiations. There seems to be a lot of movement on this. There was this boardroom coup with ExxonMobil yesterday or the day before, and this ruling in a Dutch court against Shell. So there seems to be a lot of movement in this direction. LPG is a fossil fuel, we know that. So why would we propose LPG to power and not some kind of renewable power solution?
Well, let's be honest, renewables are great. From a CO2 perspective, they are the way forward. But in the energy industry, you've got this what we call the energy trilemma, a bit like a three-legged stool, and environment is just one of the legs. And the other two are affordability and security of supply. And as you get to more and more renewables on your grid, that impacts your security of supply. And if you start putting in the systems to create that security of supply, you need to build even more renewables to feed your batteries or your compressed air energy storage or whatever, so that people have the access to the electricity 24/7, which impacts the cost to the end user. So it's finding that balance. And even if you do all that, there are times when you are not going to have sufficient renewable energy on your system. And there, LPG makes that wonderful backup. So it's there in emergency cases, even if you've got a renewables dominated grid.
Wow, excellent, excellent. Jim, would you like to contribute to that?
Sure, I'd just add, I think that, there was a lot of talk a few years ago about natural gas as a transition fuel, right? And I think that carbon-based fuels have gotten a black eye far earlier than they needed to or should have, in that for us to get to the renewable future that we're all planning for and building towards, we do need some of these fossil fuels to continue to provide resiliency and solutions in places where the grid infrastructure isn't there for grid scale renewables, and not every grid is set up and or every town or village is prepared to go to 100% renewable today. And while we're getting to that place, using natural gas or LPG in this case as a clean alternative to some of the dirtier fuels that are out there is a great way for us to get there more quickly than we will otherwise.
Okay, Christoph, anything to add?
Well, I'd just like to reiterate two things. One is the scale issue. LPG, where we're looking at it, is used in smaller scale environment. And the other thing is that if you're pitting it even against natural gas that comes in pipes, there's no leakage issue because your LPG comes very much contained in the kind of format that you require it for your power generation. So I think it is that bridge fuel quality that it brings that none of the other fuels has from an environmental and other perspective.
Okay, excellent. Our friends in the renewable energy industry are not going to like any of these answers, but we'll have to live with that. All right,
Michael, that is complementary to renewables. So as Michael was saying, it's not one or the other. It's let's go together, and that's the way we're looking at it.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, gentlemen, keeping my eye on the clock. I'll ask you for final comments, final thoughts that you'd like to share with this group. As I've mentioned, we've had a number of questions come in. And so it indicates a lot of engagement from our participants. There's a lot of interest in this subject. Jim, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. So looking through some of the questions, I see a lot of questions about size and can you do it on this fuel? Can you do it on that fuel? And I think the answer to most of those questions is yes, we have products, whether it's telecom or it's remote power for oil and gas, and we can go from a few kilowatts up to multiple megawatts and run on blends of LPG and LPG butane mix across the range of the different technologies. And so it's great to see the questions. It's great to see the engagement. Clearly, as a supplier and a manufacturer, we've got to do more education about the capabilities of our technology as well. But absolutely, LPG is a fuel that we're happy to run on, excited to run on, and are running on today. So you mentioned the project at the hotel, and it's a scalable project. It started out at a megawatt. It's now grown to 1.8, which is the other interesting thing. If you want to scale the generation, you add more. If you need to scale the fuel supply, you throw in another tank, and so it's a very flexible and usable solution in almost every part of the world.
Great, thank you, Michael. Your final thoughts, very brief. We're running up against the end here.
Okay, keep it very brief. I'd just like to promote once again the versatility of LPG as a fuel, as a backup fuel. One of the questions, where else in Africa can you use it? Well, a combined cycle plant that's being built in Togo has LPG as the backup fuel. And we're seeing other opportunities in Senegal and Cameroon and all these places. But it's also not weather dependent. It's very suitable for the cold climates as well because it doesn't freeze. I don't need to keep it heated to keep it liquid. It doesn't degrade after 6 months in a hot climate like diesel does. It's a very versatile fuel, whether you're using it as your main fuel or as a backup fuel.
Thank you, Michael. Christoph, as the chairman of the working group, your final thoughts, very brief, please.
I'd just like to thank for all those 160 participants who are still on there, that they've bared with us for the last hour. I think if you consider LPG for any of your projects, we've already achieved a lot. You need to get into the matter more deeply. The WLPGA is there to help and assist with those questions, and we look forward to seeing more and more of those projects popping up across the globe. Thank you very much, Michael.
Great, excellent way to finish. And with that, I want to thank all three of the panelists, Christoph Reimnitz, Michael Welsh, and Jim Cruz, for their participation. And I want to pass it over to Andre. I'm Michael Kelly, the Chief Advocacy Officer of the World LPG Association, and this has been LPG Talks. Andre.
Thank you, Michael, Christoph, Jim, and Michael. Very interesting discussion. Before we say goodbye, we have one last surprise to all of you. So from now until LPG Week in December 2021, we'll be airing the videos of the LPG Week featured sponsors at our webinars. Today, we will be debating the featured sponsors video showcase with ENOC. ENOC are the exclusive event host sponsors at LPG Week 2021 in Dubai. And here's the video.
We've been dreaming of a place close to our hearts. We wake up, go to work, and take our dreams with us. Behind the skyline is our story, a story of leaders and workers, innovators, artists, and families. We've been building upward, but we've also been looking forward. What drives us is the energy that makes us industrious. It's the energy that ignites our creativity and fuels our sense of adventure. From our education that yields new discoveries, to our work that propels us towards our next breakthrough, We're proud to see our ideas taking to the skies. We're building a living model of the future. We're the heroes you know and the heroes you don't. We might have different hopes, but we share the same dream. A dream of a place where anything is possible. But what powers our dreams? It's the energy that inspires us.
And this wraps our session today. I want to thank you all for being with us today, for your interest in the LPG Talks live session, and of course, in the use of LPG for power generation. I want also to thank again our speakers, Michael Welch, Christopher Reimnitz, Jim Cruz, Michael Kelly, and just Rocco. In case you want to revisit our discussion today, I'm happy to inform you that this session was recorded and will be available to all of you. There will be an exit poll that we encourage you to take to help us improve how we can be more valuable to you in these sessions. Thank you, and hope to see you again in the next edition of the LPG Talks Live. Have a good day.